A great historical question is, why isn't English a Romance language, like French, Italian, and Spanish? The Romance languages are the languages that evolved from Latin after the Roman Empire fell. We see them, as you would expect, in the former boundaries of the Roman Empire. Mostly, though not entirely, the western half of the empire, because the eastern half predominantly spoke Greek throughout its existence. We mentioned French, Italian, and Spanish, but other examples include Portuguese, Romanian, and a variety of regional languages like Sardinian and Romansh. All of these languages were derived from the Latin the Romans spoke when they ruled over the lands that these languages come from. However, there are a few regions where Latin did not survive, in spite of the fact that they were once Latin-speaking members of the Western Roman Empire. Perhaps the two most mysterious examples we find on the island the Romans called Britannia, Britain. The Romans began to conquer Britain in 43 AD, and ruled over much of the southern half, or most of what is today England and Wales, until 410 AD, meaning they were there for roughly 400 years. And yet, in the former borders of Roman Britain, we find not a Romance language, but rather a Germanic language, English, and a Celtic language, Welsh. What happened to British Latin? The answer might at first seem obvious. Soon after the Empire abandoned Britain in 410, the island was invaded and settled by people from modern-day Denmark, northern Germany, and the lowlands, collectively referred to as the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons were Germanic peoples who spoke Germanic languages which became Old English. Of course they would bring their language with them. Is it not that simple? Well, the problem is that Germanic peoples also invaded and settled much of the rest of the Western Roman Empire. France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal were all conquered and ruled by Germanic tribes as Rome collapsed. The Franks, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Lombards, etc. In each of these cases, these Germanic peoples gradually dropped their native Germanic language and adopted the local Latin. So the question is, why didn't the Anglo-Saxons do this in England? Furthermore, the plot thickens with the Welsh. The Welsh, as well as the Cornish and the Britons across the Channel, are the descendants of the British Romans, or Romano-Britons, whom the Anglo-Saxons never managed to conquer. Being unconquered, you would expect them to keep speaking Latin. But no, they seem to have factory reset themselves and returned to speaking Brythonic, the Celtic language that was spoken in Britain before the Romans even came there, which evolved into the modern Welsh, Cornish, and Breton languages. Now, you may be thinking, but isn't there a lot of Latin in English? Yes, a huge amount, but most of it actually entered indirectly, 600 years after these events, when the Normans, who spoke the Norman dialect of Old French, invaded England, and their language heavily mixed with Old English. There is a larger presence of Roman British Latin and Welsh, but nowhere near enough to make it a Romance language. Latin would of course continue to be used by the church and scholars and such things in Britain for many centuries to come, but the vulgar Latin, meaning the Latin used by common people in daily life, that was spoken in Roman Britain, all but disappeared within a few centuries of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in a way that deviates from the norm. What happened here? Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. Answering this question is complicated because written records from this time period are relatively scarce. Therefore, everything we're about to say should be taken with a grain of salt because we don't have the full picture. In fact, not even most of it. However, when Britain is compared to the other regions from which it is different, a few key differences are seen that probably explain what happened. Perhaps the best comparison is Gaul, much of which became France. Before we get into that, we would like to ask you to give this video a like if you do in fact like it, and consider subscribing if you'd like to keep up with more content like this in the future. As Brian Ward-Perkins discussed in his 2000 paper, Why Did the Anglo-Saxons Not Become More British?, Gaul and Britain had many things in common. Prior to being conquered by the Romans, they were inhabited by similar cultures who spoke similar Celtic languages. When Rome conquered them, both areas became Romanized. The Gauls became Gallo-Romans, the Britons became Romano-Britons, terms used by historians. Among the many other aspects of Roman civilization that spread here was the use of Latin. When the Western Roman Empire began to collapse in the 4th and 5th centuries, things here became unstable, and in the 5th century, both regions were invaded by fairly similar Germanic peoples, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain and the Franks in France. However, the two diverge at this point. In Gaul, resistance to the Frankish invaders was not quite as intense nor long-lasting. The Franks were quickly able to assume control of a large portion of Gaul. The Gallo-Romans and Franks would begin to cooperate, and their societies and cultures began to merge as a result. The French take the name of their country from the Franks and their language from the Gallo-Romans. The French regard both the great Gaulish king Vercingetorix and the great Frankish king Clovis as forefathers of their nation. However, the line between Romano-Briton and Germanic newcomer in Britain remained very stark. There was much less blending of cultures here. These peoples often found themselves opposed to each other throughout much of the early Middle Ages, each resisting the influence of the other, and to this day, they still consider themselves separate peoples, the English and the Welsh and Cornish. Traditionally, it was believed that the difference in outcomes was because Gaul, as well as Iberia and Italy, were each invaded by a proportionally small number of Germanic warriors who established themselves as dominant minorities over the Roman majorities, but inevitably slowly melted into the cultures of the majorities, including in terms of language, whereas Britain was invaded by a much larger proportion of Anglo-Saxons who violently pushed the Britons out of their lands altogether and established their society without them. But it is not known with certainty how many Anglo-Saxons actually arrived in Britain throughout this period, and the evidence instead seems to point to smaller numbers than was previously assumed. Regardless, this explanation does not work throughout Britain because some areas in the center or west of Britain that became culturally and linguistically Anglo-Saxon were definitely not settled by a large, overwhelming number of Anglo-Saxons, only small groups who ruled over the native Britons as a dominant minority, like on the continent. As it seems unlikely that the answer is simply that the Britons were just kicked out by the Saxons, we have to examine life in Britain at the time more closely for the full explanation. As you may recall from our videos on the histories of France, Spain, and Italy, even though the Western Roman government collapsed in the 5th century, Roman society carried on in many ways for centuries after in many former regions of the empire. When the Germanic Franks took over Gaul, they did so by integrating themselves into the large, complex, sophisticated Roman society that was already in place, and ruled it, much as the Romans had, alongside the native Romans. Gradually, they did become absorbed into the local culture of the majority to the point of becoming Romans themselves in many ways. As we also see in Italy, not only did the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great speak Latin, but he was referred to as princeps by the Roman aristocracy, implying the imperial authority of the emperors, dressed like a Roman, and acted like a Roman in many ways. In a sense, they regarded themselves as heirs of Roman civilization rather than a totally new order. However, Britain was never Romanized to quite the same extent as these other regions. Even at its height, it was always a sort of distant, rural, less developed frontier society. The presence of Roman civilization was strongest in the southeast in cities like Londinium and Camulodunum, but as you moved outside the cities, and especially as you moved north or west, even staying within Roman territory, you would have increasingly seen the native Celtic Britons living much as their ancestors did before Roman arrival. Such people made up the majority of Roman Britain's population. While we don't have any exact figures, most of the population seems to have favored the Celtic Brythonic language in daily life, and a significant portion probably could not even speak Latin, at least not well. Latin was mainly the language of the educated elite, the military, and with the adoption of Christianity especially, religion. Because the presence of Roman civilization in Britain had always been weaker, Roman Britain collapsed relatively more quickly and more significantly. The Romano-Britons were subjected to constant raids by their neighbors and eventually each other. The Roman military was often occupied on the continent, unable to help. The economy fell apart. Archaeological evidence suggests Roman infrastructure had deteriorated to a significant extent, with many Romano-Britons living among ruins in the 5th century. Others had begun to abandon the cities and towns altogether and move back into simpler settlements, like the old pre-Roman Celtic hill forts. many of those who could flee to the continent did so. Because of this breakdown, the remnant sub-Roman society was not nearly as powerful or influential in Britain as it was on the continent, and therefore integrating into it offered far fewer benefits and less prestige. It may be that when the Anglo-Saxons arrived, their culture was able to arise as the prestigious, dominant culture in Britain in a way that did not happen on the continent because Roman-British society was in such bad shape. The Anglo-Saxons were, initially, the more organized, more powerful people. Though they do not seem to have driven the majority of the Romano-British population off, rather than integrate into their existing society, they seem to have essentially bulldozed it to an extent, and reshaped it according to their customs and practices, and, naturally, occupied the majority of elite positions within this new society, thereby placing pressure on the Britons to conform to their way of doing things, including in terms of language. Even more pressure, in fact, than the distant Romans had ever placed on the Britons. As Ward-Perkins noted, because Roman civilization had collapsed here earlier, the Britons were also perhaps a bit hardier and more self-sufficient than the Gallo-Romans. At the empire's height, Britain was actually generally heavily garrisoned, but this changed as the empire began to collapse and soldiers were moved out of Britain towards conflicts affecting the core of the empire. With less ability to rely on the Roman military, they had been forced to learn to be self-sufficient and defend themselves even before the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Thus, they were willing to put up a much longer and more bitter fight against the invaders. The stiffer resistance bred more hostility and disdain between these peoples, and thus, they each rejected the cultures and languages of the other more intensely, thus leading to a stronger emphasis on Anglo-Saxon ways in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and a more intense rejection of all things Romano-British. As is discussed in the book The Anglo-Saxon World by Nicholas J. Higham and Martin J. Ryan, once brought into Anglo-Saxon society, the Britons became second-class citizens. They were less protected by Anglo-Saxon legal systems and had fewer rights and opportunities. The penalty for committing a crime against a Briton was lower than a Saxon. The use of British Vulgar Latin, and Brythonic for that matter, would have suggested association with the lower status and hostile Romano-British, which many Anglo-Saxons and aspirational Britons in Anglo-Saxon society would have wanted to avoid. On the continent, distinctions between Germanic and Roman peoples were made, and they often lived under different laws. Romans weren't allowed to marry Visigoths or Ostrogoths for quite some time, for example, but it was not quite as intense. Relations were much more amicable and cooperative, and the Germanic rulers were much more receptive to the native culture, and thus cultural blending and the loss of these distinctions became inevitable. At first, the clashing of Anglo-Saxon and Romano-British religion played out in a distinctively identical way to language. Not only did the Saxons reject British Christianity, but they probably pushed the Britons within their domains to give up Christianity and follow the customs of Germanic paganism. This is also a deviation from what happened on the continent. Although many Germanic invaders did favor a different type of Christianity called Arianism, which they did try to impress on the Romans in some cases, there was not much in the way of pushing the Romans to become Germanic pagans. When the Saxons did convert to Christianity around 600 AD, it was primarily because of influence from the Irish and the Pope, not the Britons. In essence, in Gaul, the Roman society that the Franks were taking over had remained highly complex and organized, and its native elite were more willing to grant them power and cooperate with them. It was simply more practical to integrate themselves into the existing society, which called for going native to a certain extent, and doing things as they had always been done, including in terms of language. As time passed, the distinctions between Frank and Gallo-Roman disappeared, and the bilingual Franks just started exclusively using the more common Latin language that was to become French. In Britain, the complex society had broken down to the point where the Anglo-Saxons became the more organized, dominant, and prestigious culture, and thus they made much less effort to integrate into the existing society, instead replacing it with their own, with themselves in all the powerful positions. Because the Britons were much less tolerant of Germanic rule and put up much more of a fight against them, the Saxons probably suppressed their culture even more significantly. There was less of a situation of give and take, and more of an us versus them situation where people had to conform to Anglo-Saxon ways or be left behind. For the record, Latin would heavily influence English because of the influence of the broader world which spoke it and the Romance languages that developed from it, but there are very few words in English at all which come from Brythonic, in spite of the close contact of the cultures. It is also worth noting that many of the tribes that became dominant on the continent, like the Visigoths, Franks, and Ostrogoths, had been Romanized to a certain extent even before coming to power. This was less true of the Anglo-Saxons. This explains the predominance of Old English, but why did Latin disappear from Wales and Cornwall and Brittany? Again, it seems Brythonic was always the common language the majority of the population knew and used throughout the centuries of Roman rule in Britain, whereas Latin was the language of the elite connected to Rome and of the military. Britain's connection to Rome was now withered, and the Roman military was gone. As such, there was less emphasis on retaining the minority language that Latin was for the Britons for daily use. Latin may have become more established among the common people in the southeast prior to the Anglo-Saxon invasion, but not so much outside it, namely in what became Wales and Cornwall. As we discussed, these regions had been part of the empire, but they had always been significantly less developed and Romanized than even the southeast of Britain. Here, Latin's presence had always been weaker, and its disappearance even quicker. It was from the regions where Brythonic was more common that the Britons who migrated to Brittany, and, much like the Saxons from whom they were fleeing, pushed their language on the native population, had originated. In Gaul, Italy, and Iberia, Latin had become more entrenched among the common people, making its retention easier. And so the final question is, how long did British Vulgar Latin survive? The answer to this question is not known, but it seems that it probably did not persist long past the 8th century. In case YouTube did not notify you, we made 2 videos earlier this year, one being a documentary on the cryptids of Australia, the other being a video discussing the secret plans that Russia and Napoleon tried to make to take over India together. Links to those videos will be in the description. We hope you enjoyed this video. If so, we invite you to come check out the rest of Fire of Learning, and to subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. To support the channel further, there is a link to our Patreon in the description. A special thanks once again to our current supporters listed here. This video was made without the use of AI. Thank you for watching.